Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about the Canadian delegation's visit to China as they're hoping to save their canola export business. In addition, Trump has called for the Department of Defense to be renamed the Department of War, which has left officials expressing disappointment and anger. Some mainland commentators say the real reason behind this move might just be to divert attention, especially as the EU, after repeatedly provoking China, is now facing increased anti-dumping duties on pork exports to China. Canada, meanwhile, is quietly making changes, seeking to lower China's tariffs on electric vehicles in exchange for China reducing its import tariffs on Canadian canola. Last May, Biden raised tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles by 100%, which was actually part of his election campaign, showing that he would be just as tough on China as Trump. At the time, China's response was relatively muted. Because the number of Chinese electric vehicles imported into the US is extremely low, the US tariff hike had no real impact on China. However, later on, Canada and the European Union followed suit, also using this as an opportunity to show their tough stance on China. Canada directly copied the US last October, imposing a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles without even bothering to investigate. The EU, after conducting a series of investigations, also imposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles last October, ranging from 17% to 35.3%. The actions of Canada and the EU not only coordinated with the US ahead of last November's presidential election, but also took their own electoral considerations into account. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, with Biden's support, successfully secured re-election last July. How could she have been re-elected if she didn't listen to Biden? As for Canada, Trudeau's government was originally set to hold elections this year, and at the time, he also played the anti-China card to try to win votes. But in the end, Biden lost. With Trump coming to power, Trump significantly increased tariffs on the EU and Canada. Their actions, which had previously aligned with the Biden administration's electric vehicle tax policies, ended up benefiting fewer people, but they themselves also had to bear the consequences. The EU, under von der Leyen's leadership, is still stubbornly sticking to the same path, but Canada now has a new government under Carney. There are also some signs of a slight shift in attitude. According to a recent report by the Global Times correspondent in Canada, the Canadian government, under pressure from its domestic canola industry, is currently reviewing the tariff rates on imports from China, such as electric vehicles, steel, and aluminum. They have also sent officials to join a trade delegation visiting China, hoping to find opportunities for Canada's largest agricultural export, canola, to regain access to the Chinese market. From September 6th to September 9th, the Premier of Saskatchewan, Canada's largest canola-producing province, Scott Moe, led a trade delegation to visit China. Accompanying him was Canadian Parliamentary Secretary Cody Bluey, with the joint aim of urging China to lift the punitive tariffs on Canadian canola. At a press conference, Moe stated that this visit to China would also address issues related to China's tariffs on other products such as peas, starch, pork, and seafood. However, the most urgent issue among them is canola. According to a report by the National Post, Canada's Ministry of Finance is also pushing for a review of the tariffs imposed on Chinese electric vehicles, steel, and aluminum to determine whether these tariffs on Chinese products should be maintained. A spokesperson for Canada's Ministry of Finance stated that since these tariffs were implemented, imports of the related Chinese products have dropped significantly, and the Canadian government had previously promised to review these tariffs 1 year after their introduction in October last year. Yun Chiu-pu said that after China significantly increased the provisional security deposit on Canadian canola, the export costs for Canadian canola soared, resulting in the loss of its second-largest global market, worth $4.9 billion. More than 40,000 canola growers in Western Canada each suffered losses of tens of thousands of US dollars. With the canola harvest season fast approaching, these growers are now facing a market situation where canola prices continue to decline. If the trade dispute can be resolved in China before the anti-dumping investigation concludes. Currently, as a security deposit, the provisional tariffs on canola oil may become permanent tariffs. In this situation, there is a heated debate within Canada about trading cars for canola oil. The western provinces of Canada are urging the federal government to remove tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles to avoid China imposing additional tariffs on Canadian canola. Before his visit to China, Saskatchewan Premier Moe warned that Canada must act cautiously in this trade dispute, as it is already caught between attacks from both China and the United States. He pointed out the American factor behind this dispute and said that due to the increasing instability of US trade policy, it is also very difficult to gain understanding from the Chinese side. To sum up, first, the US government is pushing its allies to encircle and suppress China, and China is strongly countering these countries. At present, Canada is starting to show signs of reconsidering its stance, but the European Union is still holding its position. going down a dead-end road. Second, the Trump alliance's self-serving approach clearly puts America first, and any country still following the US now is truly being unbelievably foolish. In addition, President Trump signed an executive order to rename the US Department of Defense as the Department of War. Ordinary officials at the Department of Defense expressed extreme disappointment, anger, and incomprehension at this move because it means wasting hundreds of millions of dollars to implement what is essentially a superficial change, which does almost nothing to address the most pressing financial needs of the US military. Challenging US defense officials may require changing the Department of Defense signage in over 40 countries and regions, as well as at more than 50 states and over 700,000 facilities across the United States. This affects every aspect, from the letterheads of the 6 major military branches and dozens of agencies, to the menus in dining halls, from the embroidery on officials' uniforms to the keychains and trinkets in the Pentagon gift shop. All of these would need to have their logos changed. Earlier, some Department of Defense officials said this was purely a performance for a domestic political audience, but doing so would consume a huge amount of time and energy. Democrats quickly pointed out the irony of this move. On one hand, this president is asking the Department of Defense to change its name to the Department of War, while on the other hand, he wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize and has promised to end the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. Did Trump see the powerful military display at China's September 3rd parade and feel he couldn't stand it, so he decided to pull a stunt by renaming the Department of Defense? Does he have an even deeper intention? Does he actually want to go to war with China? According to commentary from Shenzhen Satellite News, Yan Liuping provided a thorough analysis. Liuping said that observing Trump's administration over this period is like watching a comedy with constant ups and downs, one gag after another, so much so that even a comedy show wouldn't play out like this. In the blink of an eye, Hagel has transformed from the US Secretary of Defense into the US Secretary of War. At the same time, the United States has also become the only country in the world without a Department of Defense but with a Department of War. Moreover, this approach presents serious issues not only from legal and procedural perspectives but also from political and moral standpoints. Politically and morally speaking, the reason the United States changed the name of its War Department, which had been used for 158 years, to the Department of Defense in 1949 was clearly because, after suffering the painful lessons of 2 world wars, it realized that the nation's military should not be focused on offensive operations but rather on homeland defense. Making defense the goal also aligns with the global theme and major trend of peace and development. This means that Trump renaming the US Department of Defense back to the Department of War is an extreme abuse of power. Furthermore, from a legal and procedural standpoint, the renaming of the War Department to the Department of Defense in 1949 was done through a vote in the US Congress, and its passage signified official approval. Therefore, any renaming of the Department of Defense now must also first receive authorization from Congress. But what did Trump actually do? He first signed an executive order directly carrying out the action. At the same time, he was in such a rush that he even changed the title of the person in charge and couldn't wait to use forceful means to remove the Pentagon sign, showing a style of governance where he acts first and talks later. This approach not only bypasses the legislative process in the US, but also shows a disregard for legislative authority. According to Liuping's analysis, there are several motivations behind Trump's urgency. First, according to Trump himself, there are 2 main reasons. First, in 1949, the United States changed the Department of War to the Department of Defense, a move pushed by the then-ruling Democratic Party, which belonged to the American left or was part of the globalist awakening movement. This was also meant to make upholding human justice and world peace the new founding goals and ideals of the United States. Because of this, Trump's move to rename the Department of Defense back to the Department of War is mainly aimed at the internal political struggle in the US, and is also intended to strike at the left and progressivism. The reason Trump acknowledges is that before 1949, when the US Department of War had not yet been renamed, the US military not only won the 1783 War of Independence against Britain, the 1848 War with Mexico, and the 1865 Civil War to abolish slavery, but also led the Allies to victory in both World War I and World War II. However, after the name was changed to the Department of Defense in 1949, the once dominant US military found itself powerless, unable to win in the Korean Peninsula, and after the Vietnam War, had to withdraw in defeat. At the same time, in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they also failed to successfully transplant the American-style democratic system into these countries. This means that faced with the embarrassing situation of repeated defeats since World War II, Trump attempted to change the fate of the US military and the nation by renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War. However, Liu Heping believes that there may be 2 other underlying reasons for this renaming. The first is related to China's military parade. Trump had previously stated publicly that he watched China's military parade very seriously and was deeply impressed by the new weapons China showcased. After the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit and the conclusion of China's military parade, Trump suddenly and quite abruptly, he announced the renaming of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. Perhaps he was strongly provoked by something and tried to use this high-profile move to boost his own morale. Another, possibly more important reason is the Epstein scandal. Liu Heping said that during a certain period, whenever people found Trump's actions to be inexplicable or even bizarre, if you linked them to the Epstein scandal, you would basically find the answer. Previously, Trump also very suddenly held a US-Russia summit. His purpose wasn't to mediate any major conflict, but simply to create a sensational news event to divert public attention from the Epstein scandal. Recently, Trump has once again been sharpening his knives, making a big show of deploying troops to the Caribbean and posturing as if he's about to attack Venezuela. In reality, this is just another attempt by Trump, after the farce of mediating conflicts has ended, to create a new media hotspot and shift public focus away from the Epstein scandal. So, what about Trump now? Suddenly and without reason, he announced that the Department of Defense would be renamed the Department of War. This can be seen as an escalation by Trump to divert public attention from the Epstein scandal because there is widespread suspicion that Trump himself is on the Epstein list that the US Department of Justice has kept hidden. Moreover, there are already survivors of the Epstein case who want to come forward, claiming they have obtained audio recordings related to the sex scandal. It's worth noting that when the Epstein case survivors held an outdoor press conference, Trump even sent at least 5 fighter jets to fly over the event, attempting to disrupt the proceedings by creating overwhelming noise. This shows that, in order to cover up the Epstein scandal, Trump has reached the point where he will stop at nothing and is willing to do whatever it takes. Perhaps it can be summed up this way. First, looking at the current situation in the United States is truly speechless. A president, just to cover up his own scandal, can keep making various major and even bizarre decisions to divert attention, causing his country to pay unnecessary costs. Second, the biggest challenge facing the US right now is how to restrain a president who, for self-preservation, is making increasingly extreme decisions. Is this kind of unchecked democracy really the system that America wants to force other countries to copy?